Today we have another seed oil survival discussion, and this one is two friends who've been on the program several times in various different conversations with other folks and with them and with each other. But today we're talking about an important topic. Now, we all agree in this exploration of this podcast that seed oils are a problem and that they should be avoided. But the question comes down to, well, what can you eat in replacement? What can you eat instead of them? And that opens up a lot of different opinions and the coalition of people who understand that seed oils are a big problem in the health crises that we face. So today we have Tucker Goodrich and Brad Marshall with us. Tucker Goodrich does the blog yelling-stop at .blogspot.com. He also has his own podcast and has joined me, as you know, on several of our discussions here. And Brad Marshall is the proprietor of Fire in a Bottle, and he also does Fire Brand Meats, where he's trying to help folks understand the importance of limiting their exposure to linoleic acid, which is the problematic acid in the PUFA heavy products that so many people are exposed to. But today we're talking about oleic acid.
And David, let's point out one very important thing. Brad is trying to provide an alternative to the high linoleic fats, that the high linoleic animal meats that are the product of the industrial food system currently, right, which is a very important thing to be doing.
Yeah, yes. It's very important to do that. And so what we're trying to discuss is oleic acid, which is always that conversation that doesn't happen. You never hear people talk about monounsaturated fat too much in the broader conversation about this. People talk about PUFA and they talk about saturated fat. If you go, whichever category, if you're listening to Ray Peed and Georgi Dinkov and the bioenergetic world, they're talking about saturated fat and they're talking about staying away from PUFA. But what about monounsaturated fat? These MUFAs or the oleic acid rich foods. That's the conversation today that we're going to facilitate. And I want to keep everybody kind of having equal time and minimizing interruptions between one another, because we're just going to try to focus on the data and the facts and just make a case for or against oleic acid and these MUFA, monounsaturated fatty acid products. So thank you guys for coming on.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, David.
So we'll start with Tucker. So you are kind of in the pro monounsaturated fat category, right? You are pro oleic acid. You think that that is something that people, whether it's olive oil or avocado oil or other foods, and you can maybe list a few others that are rich in omega and a monounsaturated fat that people would eat. You're saying don't worry about that. Those are a good, healthy alternative fuel source outside of the PUFA category. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say. I think oleic is generally a neutral fat, and it's beneficial to the extent that it is replacing harmful fats, right? So I wouldn't consider myself an oleic fanboy. I hadn't thought too much about it. I mean, I've thought a lot about it, but I haven't, it's not like, I don't think you're going to make yourself a healthier person by going out of your way to eat oleic acid in the context of an otherwise healthy diet. I think it's a neutral food source, like lots of other foods that we eat, right?
What does it mean to be a neutral food source?
Meaning it's not beneficial and it's not harmful. Right.
And what are some of the, for beginner listeners, what are some foods that are common and rich with oleic acid?
Most animal fats are rich in oleic acid.
Like what percentage is your conventional beef going to have? What percentage of the fat in conventional beef would be oleic acid? Do you know offhand?
I think it's around, Brad probably knows this better than I do. I think it's around 30%. It can be higher. Some lards are up around 40%.
Yeah, I think that lard is actually usually more like 50. And I think beef is also in that range, 45, 50, something like that.
Right. So if you're eating basically, unless you're going out of your way not to eat oleic acid, you're going to be eating a lot of oleic acid because it's in pretty much all fats that you're going to consume in some quantity. Maybe, probably less in things like coconut oil and fish oil. I wouldn't recommend consuming a lot of fish oil. But, if you're eating animal foods and most plant fats, you're going to be getting a lot of oleic acid.
And Brad, Marshall, you are someone who would say, hey, this is something you got to be careful about if you are having problems, especially metabolic dysfunction from PUFA and other related issues along that line, right?
Yeah, and so to clarify, what I think is, I think that fats that are a very high ratio of oleic acid are very problematic. I think olive oil is somewhere around 70-75% monounsaturated fat, depending on the specific olive oil, of course. And I think that if you look at that ratio compared to something like beef suet, so beef suet is about 30 to 40% oleic acid, and it's very high in saturated fat. It's maybe 60 to 65% saturated fat. And to be clear, beef suet is a fat from around the kidneys of the cow. It's not the fat the fat that's in ground beef is going to be higher in monounsaturated and lower in saturated, is going to be higher in monounsaturated fat and lower in saturated fat than suet, which is specifically kidney fat. And so,
which is similar to lard in pork, right? Lard is also the kidney fat primarily.
It is. Lard is often the kidney fat, but beef suet is actually much more saturated than lard is. And I say that as a pig farmer, and I produce lard, and I would love it if the lard was even more saturated, but it is what it is. And so, right.
Yeah,
and so
just to make Brad's point, I once bought a 5-gallon bucket of beef tallow, which is the rendered suet, and it's so saturated, it's like a bar of soap or a candle. I had to use a chisel to get the stuff out of the tub to do deep frying with.
Right, but the nice thing sometimes about beef tallow is if you turn the whole bucket upside down and you just bang it on the bottom, the whole thing will just drop out like a block. That's how saturated it can be.
Yeah.
But
okay, I never tried that. Thanks for the tip.
Yeah, and so that's a really saturated fat. And so, one of the things that right, and so as we've kind of like alluded to, right, so we have these camps, and obviously you have your sort of plant-based camps are kind of anti-saturated fat, and you have your keto camps are becoming more and more anti polyunsaturated fats, and everyone, I think, sort of tacitly agrees that oleic acid is fine without really considering the evidence. And so, and that's kind of what I want my place in the debate to be, to really think about what's the appropriate amount of oleic acid, because no one is really speaking a lot about that, right? Right. I don't think the conversation about what is the sort of appropriate ratio of oleic acid to saturated fat has really been happening, and I'm concerned. So one of the first studies, and I shared this with Tucker on Twitter, that really jumped out at me is there's a study in rats that was done. I think it was like the year 2000. It's been around a while, and what you see, and so they compared 4 different oils. And one of them is a beef tallow that is quite high in saturated fat. I think it's about 30% monounsaturated fat. And then they have palm oil, which is a little more monounsaturated and a little less saturated. And then they have olive oil, and they also have sunflower oil. Mm-hmm. Right. And so out of all of those 4 oils, and so what they're looking at lipogenic enzymes in the liver, and they're looking at liver fat accumulation and other things too. But those are the things that really jumped out to me, is that the mice given the olive oil, which is a very high percentage of monounsaturated fat to saturated fat, have massively increased lipogenic enzyme expression compared even to the sunflower oil. And they have significantly more liver fat. I think double or more than double what the beef tallow has, but they also have significantly more liver fat compared to the sunflower oil. And then And then there's a lot of more recent studies, certainly in mice. There's another study in pigs showing the same thing. So they compared beef tallow to oleic acid, and these studies are not using huge amounts of oleic acid. They're only using maybe 5 to 7% of the diet by weight. So that's maybe 10 to 13 or 14% of the diet by calories. And so you see in rats and you see in pigs that olive oil, really increases lipogenic enzyme expression in the liver and increases fat accumulation in the liver. And then, so that sort of got me looking around, and then, a bunch more studies recently done. I printed out a couple of them just so I can keep my track, but there's one recently in, look, I made a little thing. I don't know if people can actually read this. Is it front ways?
Yeah.
Anyway,
Dietary, let me read it. Dietary oleic acid regulates hepatic lipogenesis through a liver X receptor dependent signaling. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. And so what we saw, and so this is from that study. And again, what you see, so you see this here with the kind of like, I don't know, grayish, purplish color. So that is mice fed a diet that's about 50-50. And it's only like 10 or 12% of the calories is fat, but this is sort of PUFA and MUFA together. Whereas this one here that's more red, this is pure olive oil. You see the OLIV. So that one's pure olive oil. And that red color is actually liver fat accumulation. So you can see how much redder this one is. So when you give them the pure olive oil, you see that liver fat accumulation again. And I just want to make sure. So, and these are different lipogenic enzymes and desaturase enzymes. And every one of them is massively upregulated by pure oleic acid, right? And so what those enzymes are, one of them is fatty acid synthase, and that's increased fourfold. And of course, that is the enzyme that literally makes fat. But also these desaturases, SCD1 and FADS2, which is also known as delta-6 desaturase, are upregulated by a relatively small amount of oleic acid. And the problem, and FADS2 or delta-6 desaturase is actually the limiting enzyme that controls how fast linoleic acid is converted to arachidonic acid. And that conversion of linoleic acid to arachidonic acid is the first step in going down that road of creating the oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. And so, what seems to happen is that dietary oleic acid is upregulating the enzymes that cause the polyunsaturated fats to get oxidized, which I think Tucker would agree with me that, it's really these oxidized linoleic acid metabolites that are causing a lot of the true and real problems. And it seems like the pure dietary oleic acid or something like olive oil that's 70% seems to accelerate this process of oxidizing the polyunsaturated fats. I don't know if Tucker wants to respond. I've got another more recent paper that goes on along those, that shows more evidence along those lines.
Well, let's let Tucker respond to what you presented so far.
Yeah, the rat study that Brad was talking about, I've been through, and the problem with Brad's correct in noting that it upregulates the enzymes that control conversion of fats, and he's correct that it upregulates the liver fat in the fat in the liver. What he's not correct about is that this translates to an increase in obesity, right? The olive oil fed rats were in the middle of the pack as far as how obesogenic the diet was. They did two different protocols on this diet, one where they let them eat as much as they want, in which case there was no difference between any of the different diets in terms of obesity, and then another one where they limited how much they could eat. And both times, the high oleic diet wasn't the standout diet in terms of its obesogenic effects. The standout diet in both cases, but more in the second case, was the tallow diet, which interestingly enough was also the diet that had the least linoleic acid in it, right? So I don't think he's correctly representing what happened in that study. I also don't think there's any evidence that eating excess oleic acid accelerates the oxidation of, linoleic acid or arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid metabolism is pretty much dependent on how much linoleic acid you eat, and also how much of it you get directly from food sources, which are mostly animal fats. And also the other key point is that when you consume linoleic acid, generally, if you're getting it from seed oil, you're getting it in the oxidized state already, because processing oxidizes these fats. So they're coming into the body oxidized. The other issue I have with both of the studies that Brad's looking at is that they're doing this in the context of a high linoleic acid diet, right? So what's the thing that's actually driving this, right? Is it the high linoleic acid diet, which we know mechanistically causes obesity, right? We have studies, famously the Alfheim study from 2012, where they keep the amount of oleic acid constant across the different dietary arms, and they vary their amounts of linoleic acid and saturated fat in the diet. And saturated fat has an inverse relationship with obesity if it's replaced with linoleic acid, which causes obesity, and they provide a mechanism for it causing obesity, which doesn't have anything to do with the presence of oleic acid in the diet. So I feel that Brad is picking bits out of this study that support his argument, especially in the rat study, without noting that it didn't produce obesity, right? And he did, going through his video, how olive oil makes you fat, he cites a bunch of human studies, and in none of these studies do they find that increasing olive oil intake makes people obese. In fact, there are studies, there's an RCT that I've shown, Nigam 2014, that again was an oil substitution study. They started off with, I think, safflower oil, which has the most linoleic acid and the least oleic acid. And then that was the most obesogenic arm. And then they had a canola oil, which is kind of a middle ground fat. That was that caused some weight loss. And then they had the olive oil diet. And the olive oil was the best in terms of weight loss, right? So increasing the oleic acid consumption in humans in an RCT caused weight loss, not weight gain, right? So we can't get too hung up with, looking at specific enzymes and picking points out of a very complicated metabolic process and saying that this is going to lead to this endpoint when we have data showing that it doesn't actually do that, right? And I can point to a number of the different studies that Brad presents in his video where it doesn't cause obesity.
Well, let's take the ones that we've started with so far, the rat ones. Brad, what do you?
Well, actually, can I show one more study that I think actually answers a lot? So, and I should have sent this to Tucker earlier, and I'd sort of almost forgotten about it, but so this is one more study, and I apologize, I forgot to grab the title, but it's called something along the lines of omega-6 and omega-3 oxylipins contribute to soybean oil based obesity.
And so Diol and Slatic are the authors on that.
Yeah, right. And so what they do, and you kind of have to look in the what do you call it, in the the supplemental data to really see. And so what they do in this is they show actually so they have this oil called plenish. I don't know if we can see this on the screen. Yeah. So they have this oil called plenish, and what plenish is it is about 75% monounsaturated fat. And one of the things, to Tucker's point, I think when you feed olive oil to humans, I do absolutely believe that the olive oil polyphenols are very effective. And when you give those olive oil polyphenols to mice, it will prevent a lot of the diet-induced obesity. So I think olive oil is this very complicated thing that on the one hand, it's introducing a lot of oleic acid. On the other hand, it's producing it. You're also getting this kind of curveball that might actually be helping And so to me,
Brad,
I find,
if I could just address that point, you
Sure.
show a human study where they tested that, and it does not show that the polyphenols in humans produce any additional weight loss in excess to what they occurred by using a refined olive oil. So again, it's an interesting hypothesis. It's been tested in a study that you included in your video, and it doesn't support your conclusion.
Look, and so there's no doubt that it's complicated. And so what happens is oleic acid, anyway, let me just finish presenting this, and then I'll go on to deal with that point. So anyways, I use that as an illustration because what happens in this study is, in fact, the mice given this plenish do become significantly fatter than the mice given these other diets they show initially. So, and just to be clear, so I don't know if we can really see it on there, but I wrote down the different fat compositions of the different diets. And what they do in that study, they, unfortunately, they pull a little trick on us. If you look the axis from 0 to 25, they extend the axis from 25 to 50. See, this is a much bigger gap than the axis from 0 to 25. So they do this experiment about 4 or 5 times, and sometimes they do it with plenish versus soybean oil, and they do it with olive oil versus soybean oil. But in both cases, the high MUFA diets make the mice essentially equally as fat as the soybean oil diets. And in fact, they do another diet at the beginning that's half coconut oil and half soybean oil. And so that diet is about 10% linoleic acid, and it's about 4% oleic acid. And the diet that's only 2.6% linoleic acid and about 26% oleic acid makes the mice significantly fatter than the diet with the 10% linoleic acid. And so they show mice where, let me just repeat that. 2.6% linoleic acid mice became fatter than mice that got 10% linoleic acid. So about 4% or 4 times the linoleic acid, but much less oleic acid. And those mice did not get nearly as fat as the ones given significantly more oleic acid, but very small amount of linoleic acid. And just to go on with that point, so here you can see these little circles up here in the red, and those little pink dots you can see are very much elevated, and those are oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. And what happens is the mice fed, so this diet is only 1.4% linoleic acid, but it's 14% oleic acid, which is higher than this one's only 4% oleic acid, but it's got 10% linoleic acid. And the diet with very, very small amount of linoleic acid, but much more oleic acid, has far more of these oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. And so the oleic acid, by upregulation of delta-6 desaturase, is absolutely driving more oxidation of polyunsaturated fats. And just furthermore, this is from that same study. And again, this is from the supplemental, but what you see is in addition to the fact that the mice fed, that 75% oleic acid diet became nearly as fat as the ones fed olive oil, they have massively more liver fat accumulation. And so you see that on the top is the plenish, that's 75% oleic acid. You see the olive oil, very high liver fat accumulation. And even the lard, which is again like 50-ish% oleic acid, you see that liver fat accumulation again. And so you see this consistent pattern where a diet that is too heavily oleic acid, and it does have to do with the ratio of monounsaturated fat to saturated fat. You see again and again, you see more oxidized linoleic acid with increasing oleic acid, and then you see obesity and you see liver fat accumulation. And then furthermore, I just looked, and of course, here's another fun study just to show that point. This is in
Brad. Wait. Before you
Sure.
pull the vegan thing on me and run through study after study without
Sure.
giving me a chance to comment on it.
Yeah, sorry, and I should have sent this one in the first flesh. I just,
I'm very familiar with it. David and I actually interviewed one of the authors, Bruce Hammock, a couple of years ago. So your conclusion is different from their conclusion. Their conclusion is we show that while the GM soybean oil plenish induces less obesity and insulin resistance than conventional soybean oil. Okay. Now, the difference between plenish and conventional in soybean oil, by design, plenish is a genetically modified oil produced by DuPont to have less linoleic acid and more oleic acid. So what are they saying here? It induces less obesity and insulin resistance than conventional soybean oil, right? And they do talk about negative effects that it has on liver function. And I think, I think you're raising an interesting point here, and then one that we do need to consider, which is that in the context of a high linoleic acid diet producing, and, to your point about the oxylipins, what causes obesity from linoleic acid isn't the linoleic acid itself. It's what it converts into in the body. Things like the endocannabinoids and the aldehydes and the oxylipins. So the pathway from dietary linoleic acid to these different chemicals that have the actual effects on the body can vary in different circumstances, right? But you're making an interesting point that in that context, excess oleic acid may accelerate that process, right?
Right.
But wait, that's way different from saying that in the context of a normal low linoleic acid diet, that oleic or low linoleic acid diet, yes, that oleic acid is obesogenic, right?
Well,
they're two different things. I mean, it's really interesting, interesting potentially when people who are fighting obesity are trying to figure out what to eat. Is it possible that, if you're eating, one of my issues with olive oil as a fat is that olive oil can go from what I consider to be a healthy level of fat or a healthy level of omega-6 fats, 2%, all the way up to 21% of fats as omega-6, right? Without even getting into the issue of fraud in the olive oil market, which is a huge problem. There's just a huge diversity in the fatty acid profile of different olive oils naturally. The same thing is true with avocado oil, right? Huge diversity of fatty acid profiles. That's a really interesting point, but that really doesn't support the basic argument that you made in a couple of the studies that you cited, that people who eat a lot of olive oil tend to be obese. There's you don't show any evidence that supports that conclusion.
Well, let me just
that's happening because of the oleic acid that they're consuming.
Right. So let me just go back and say that in that study we were just talking about, you say that the authors conclude that plenish is less fattening than the regular soybean oil, and that's actually
I quoted them.
So right, no, I know you're quoting them, and so what happens in their study though is that's actually true, and I'll just throw this up again. It's not the best visual, apologize, but so that's true. So they do that here. Here's what they show. It's slightly less, and that's in the context of basically they're splitting that. You can see the plus coconut oil. So what they're doing is they're cutting the plenish 50-50 with hydrogenated coconut oil. So that's pure saturated fat there. And like I say, that's getting closer to a MUFA to saturated fat balance, right? That's like 50-50. It's not even 50-50. It's actually more saturated fat than it is MUFA. And that brings this number down. But over here, this one, they do the same experiment. And so that is just plenish versus regular soybean oil. And you can see that, maybe there's a tiny difference, but these mice do become more obese than any of the mice cut with coconut oil. And not only do the mice fed the plenish get essentially equally as fat as to the ones fed regular soybean oil. And that's only with That's what 2.6% of their calories is linoleic acid, right? So this is a low PUFA diet, and these mice are fatter than the mice over here fed 10% linoleic acid, and they also have significantly more liver fat accumulation. And so
you're begging the question there. At what point does linoleic acid start becoming a problem? You're assuming it's somewhere between those two numbers, but we've seen studies.
No, I'm saying
I know you've seen them because Peter from Hyperlipid has talked about them. There's one looking at the Sirwit diet, which is a primarily butter and sugar-based diet that has been a big confounder for both Peter and myself over the years, trying to figure out why that diet, which has 2-point-something% linoleic acid in it, is so obesogenic, right? And It turns out that if you block the obesogenic metabolites of linoleic acid in that diet, it stops being obesogenic. So even though it has a small amount of linoleic acid and not much oleic acid, because they're using butter, which is one of the more, which is richer in other fats than, say, olive oil, it's still a standard pro-obesogenic diet, and the effects of that are still blocked by blocking the effects of linoleic acid.
Right,
agreed. Linoleic acid.
Right, but that's exactly what I'm saying, right? And so in this study, again, it's only 2.6% linoleic acid, but it's incredibly obesogenic because it's also 26% oleic acid. And oleic acid increases delta-6 desaturase, and it's the first step in oxidizing those polyunsaturated fats. So the more...
But delta-6 desaturase from... Okay. I would love to see a study showing that consuming olive oil increases the conversion of linoleic acid into arachidonic acid, for instance. Do you have a study that shows that?
I mean, several of the studies that I sent over to you. One thing I do have, and this is in humans.
Brad, wait. Let's finish this point before we go on to the next one. Let's just finish this point for the audience. Linoleic acid is the precursor omega-6 fatty acid. Arachidonic acid can be made from linoleic acid in the body. There are a number of steps that the body has to go through to do that. It's a regulated conversion, right? One of the factors that upregulates that is excess linoleic acid. And it's done through these fatty acid enzymes that Brad is talking about, one of which is delta-6 dehydrogenase.
Delta-6 desaturase. So it adds the first...
That's right. Thank you.
It adds the first double bond or an additional double bond to make it triply unsaturated.
Right.
And that's the first step.
I've not seen arachidonic acid implicated in obesity outside of the stomach or outside of the intestine, right? In the intestine, linoleic acid is converted into arachidonic acid, which is then made into two endocannabinoids that drive overeating, hyperphagia, what the literature calls it, right? But it's overeating.
Right.
And in that process, what's really interesting here, there's another counter-regulatory enzyme called OEA. And again, I'm not going to remember exactly what that stands for.
Sure.
But OEA is a similar chemical to the endocannabinoids that is a satiety signal, right? And the production of OEA from oleic acid in the intestine is blocked by the consumption, apparently, of linoleic acid, because that only happens in the context of these high linoleic acid obesogenic diets, right? If you give an animal that has been made fat by a high linoleic acid diet, OEA, it reverses the obesity phenotype instantly, right? So the pattern it's been shown, right? Instantly reverts to the norm. You stop giving them OEA and they instantly revert back to obesity, right? And this is made from oleic acid, right? So in a normal body, what seems to happen is that oleic acid is the key producer of satiety, right? So now we know a couple of things. We know that of the 3 macronutrients that people eat, protein doesn't cause obesity, carbohydrates don't cause obesity, and yes, everybody's brain's going to blow up on that one, but only fat produces obesity, and the fat stimulates the hyperphagic signals, and it's oleic acid that produces the counter signal, the stop eating signal.
Yes.
Right?
So oleic acid produces OEA for a while, but in the lab, if you give a mouse a high, either a high sugar diet or a high fat diet, which is the classic, like mostly lard with a little bit of soybean oil, those mice stop producing OEA within a week. So it's unclear how long in humans the OEA signal lasts. We just don't know that, right? That's never been tested in humans. We don't know the difference between obese and lean humans and whether or not obese humans still produce OEA postprandially. But we know that in the lab with mice, the OEA signal is lost within a week. Within a week, let's say,
only in the context of a high linoleic diet, acid diet, or sugar, not so much. Doesn't have the same effect on the endocannabinoid system that linoleic acid does.
But either one, we don't know. The fact is those.
Right. But we have human studies looking at sugar, and what they find is that sugar in water is slightly obesogenic, and sugar not in water in foods is not obesogenic.
Right, but here's what I would say. I do not believe that OEA is the body's primary satiety signal. I think there are lots of other things, leptin and there's PYY, etc. I think that OEA is a specific thing with olive oil that is not super reliable, frankly. That sometimes in some contexts when you consume olive oil, you produce OEA, and that limits appetite. Other times that is not the case, and we don't really know a whole lot about it, right?
Well, we do though. We know what stops production of it, right? And I was quite surprised when I came across OEA originally, because I thought that it was some direct effect of linoleic acid on the body that was causing overeating, and it's actually not. It's the fact that it's blocking a satiety signal, right? And
right, but
lots of papers looking at humans. I mean, they're even starting to promote OEA as an anti-obesity drug because of this consistent effect it has on satiety.
Right, but you don't. But most obese humans probably don't make much OEA upon consuming olive oil, and that's the problem. And so,
because they're eating a lot of linoleic acid in the context of that diet.
Right? Yeah, I haven't seen that evidence. I mean, I know that the diet that stops OEA production in the lab is, of course, it's the standard, lard with a 2.5% of soybean oil or something. So it's about
12492.
Yeah, so it's like 36% monounsaturated. It's 30% saturated, and it's 20-something percent PUFA. And so that diet has more MUFA than PUFA, but I don't know what blocks it.
Right, but it's not okay.
Sugar also blocks it.
David, can I share things? I didn't print things out like Brad did, so if
I'm very low tech. That's my baseline, is low tech.
It's part of your charm. But David, if you could let me share my screen here. Go
ahead.
Are you able to do that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, there we go. Okay, let me find what I'm looking for here real quick.
Brad, did you have a point you wanted to make that would not go off?
Well, so what if we're going to stay on the topic of satiety for a second? There's another paper that shows that oleic acid directly binds the enzyme FAAH, and I definitely sent that to Tucker, and that essentially directly binds the enzyme that breaks down the cannabinoids AEA, which is also called anandamide. So anandamide is a cannabinoid, and it leads to hyperphagia. It also leads to insulin resistance. And oleic acid directly binds that enzyme and blocks blocks the breakdown of cannabinoids. And so, in that study, they show a lot of incidences of high oleic acid leading to increased cannabinoids and the ensuing insulin resistance. And so olive oil on the one end with OEA is causing in certain instances can decrease appetite, but in other instances can block the breakdown of cannabinoids and caused hyperphagia. And so to me, that looks like kind of a switch.
Well, the cannabinoids are the pro-eating signal. The OEA is the anti-eating signal.
Right. And olive oil can increase cannabinoids by blocking the enzyme FAAH, which breaks them down. And it directly binds oleic acid directly binds to FAAH and prevents the breakdown of cannabinoids.
Okay, but again, you're picking parts out of a very complicated system. That doesn't seem to translate, based on the studies you've shown, into obesity. Okay, so can you guys see the image I'm sharing?
Yeah, a little bit. Can you zoom in a little more, or is there a way to?
Let's see. That's an interesting question. Is that bigger?
Make it full.
At any rate, so this is looking at the D12492 diet. That's the standard obesogenic diet, and two other diets from a paper, Alfheim 2012, in which they tried to figure out which fats in the diet are actually causing obesity, right? So D12492 is on the right-hand side, and the two Alfheim diets are on the middle and the left. The difference between those two diets, one has about 2% linoleic acid. The other has about 8% linoleic acid. That's the yellow boxes. And the D12492 has 19% linoleic acid, right? The 8% and the 19% linoleic acid diets are both obesogenic, right? The diet on the left-hand side, the 2% linoleic, or I think it's actually 1% linoleic acid diet, is not obesogenic. The gray bars in the back are the represent the macronutrients in the diet, right? So it's the same amount of protein, carbohydrates, and fat. And the MUFA in the diet is 7% in the two Alfheim diets, the same in the obesogenic and non-obesogenic diet, and then 22% in the obesogenic D12492 diets, right? So while they weren't exactly looking to do this, basically what these authors wound up doing was coming up with a test of what's the obesogenic component in these diets, right? And what they found is that the MUFA doesn't seem to make a difference. It's the linoleic acid content that makes a difference. And also the omega-3, just to mention an aside, appears to block some of the effects of linoleic acid, but it doesn't have an effect on oleic acid because it's working through different pathways.
Yeah, and I mean,
You want to show something else there, or do you want to close it out?
No, I'll stop sharing if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. Are we back?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I've seen those studies, but it still doesn't explain it still doesn't explain why plenish is intensely obesogenic at only 2.6% linoleic acid and 26% oleic acid. That was the final percent of calories in the diet in the final experiment. Right. And so plenish,
the conclusion of that study is that the more oleic acid you had in those diets, the less obesogenic it was, right? That's what they said in the conclusion of their paper, and that's what their data showed.
Wait, sorry.
So if you're arguing,
well, this is their data. This is their data right here, and this is soybean oil plotted versus plenish, and you can see that the plenish and full-on soybean oil are equally fattening. Right? That's their data. This is out of the supplemental of their paper,
well, they're not
and
equally.
obviously
the lines aren't identical.
Okay, well, they're not identical, but they're both, they're essentially
Okay, so then
Put that up. Put that
why?
closer to the camera, please.
right. And so you can see, well, yeah, if I have to draw it
Here,
out to
hold on.
show the macronutrients, but anyways, I mean, they're you know, the plenish is essentially as fattening as olive oil, full on olive oil. And so what they do, and again, I said this, but see, in this one, this is the study that they quote. And what they do in this one is they add 50% coconut oil to everything. And so when that monounsaturated fat is balanced out by an equivalent amount of saturated fat, then it looks like the plenish is less fattening. Oops, did we lose me?
No.
Oh
No,
yeah,
no,
there we
you're
go.
still there. I'm just
There
zooming
we
in
go.
on that study.
Sure. And so you have to go to the supplemental to see all the good stuff.
Oops. There we go. Let's zoom in on those pictures if I can make this work.
Who's the ones behind this paper?
It's Bruce Hammock,
Bruce Hammock?
Deal. I can't remember his first name, and Francis Sladek at UC Davis.
Okay.
They were originally hired to. This is hanging. I'm going to stop sharing it. They were originally hired to look at the difference between plenish and soybean oil, and they found that plenish is less obesogenic than regular soybean oil. And the difference between plenish and regular soybean oil is that the regular soybean oil has less oleic acid and more oleic acid than the plenish, right? Plenish is a genetically modified soybean that isn't able to make as much linoleic acid and instead makes more oleic acid.
Right. But that only worked when they cut the oils 50% with hydrogenated coconut oil is the thing.
No, in the original study, there's a couple other studies that they've done with this. That was the conclusion of their first study. In this study, they're trying to figure out what is the actual mechanism for the difference.
Right. But in this study, they do show a direct comparison of soybean oil versus plenish, and they're roughly equally fattening, despite the fact that plenish is only 2.6% linoleic acid. But it is huge, but it's very high in oleic acid. And like I say, they also show that the high oleic acid has more oxidized lipins or oxylipins, whatever you want to call them, than does the diets that are higher in linoleic acid. Right. The thing that predicts oxylipins in that experiment is more oleic acid than linoleic acid content. The oleic acid is the thing that predicts the oxylipins.
But that's not translating into the pathology that you're worried about, Brad.
Well, it's translating into liver fat accumulation, and it is translating into obesity when you give them directly soybean oil versus plenish. I mean, look at the liver fat accumulation in the plenish diet. It's massively higher than the soybean oil diet.
But that's not obesity.
Okay, but we don't really want fatty liver either, right? And I think we can all sort of agree that the general metabolic syndrome, liver fat accumulation and obesity and diabetes are all kind of roughly in the same genre of problems.
Right. So then we need to go back to humans again. Okay. And what do we see in humans? In humans, we've been treating patients with short liver or short gut syndrome for decades with a soybean oil diet. Right. And what happens to those people? They get fatty liver, they get insulin resistance, they get hyperglycemia. It leads to liver failure and they die often, right? One of the treatments for that, there's another one that works even better, but is Linoleic. Linoleic is a replacement for intralipid, a soybean oil-based fat. Linoleic is made primarily from olive oil. It's low in linoleic acid. It's very high in oleic acid, and it doesn't produce the same pathology in humans, right? And we have decades of data on this. So this is a nice model, but we don't really care what happens to mice. We care what happens to people. And in people, we see very clearly that if you replace if you increase the oleic acid level of lipid infusion, they get a better result, right? They don't get diabetes, and they get less diabetes, and they get less fatty liver.
Sure, and I'm not shocked that replacing pure. I don't believe in eating pure soybean oil either. Like, that's a terrible idea. I think both. I don't. I wouldn't want to eat either of those diets personally. I'm just thinking about anyway, what did I do with my right? So, but here's the thing. And so then, if we want to look at people, this is epidemiology, but if you look at Italy, they have the second highest rate of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in the world that we know about, and this is the study that shows that. It's probably hard to read, but you can take a look at that if you want. And they're rapidly encroaching on the U.S. So fatty liver disease in Italy, according to this, they think will surpass levels in the U.S. by the year 2030. And so what? And obviously that's epidemiology, but nonetheless, I mean, we don't have a lot of direct comparisons of these kind of long-term trends in diets in humans. I mean,
but the ones that we do, one of the first studies that you cite in your video is a study looking at obesity in Italy and Greece. And what they conclude is that it's probably because they're eating less olive oil and they're going towards a Western diet. We won't get into the absurdity of saying that Greece and Italy don't eat a Western diet, the two foundations of Western civilization. But at any rate, they blame, as nutritionists, as you note in that video always do, they blame increased consumption of saturated fat and animal fats, right? But they're not blaming an increase in olive oil. They're blaming a decrease in olive oil.
Well, of course they're not. They're disciples of Ansel Keys. I mean, that's what they're going to conclude.
But it doesn't support your argument. And then the paper you cite doesn't support your argument.
If you're just saying that the conclusions of the authors don't support my argument, of course they don't, because people base their conclusions on what they want to conclude, right?
But there's a difference between what the data show. Their claim is their data shows that people are eating less olive oil and more of other oils, right? Which they say are animal fats, and I will presume are actually vegetable oils, because that's what happens in most populations. The other paper that you cite actually goes out and does a better job of epidemiology, and through food frequency questionnaires, which are problematic, looks at what people are eating in a Mediterranean diet, which is rich in olive oil, and finds that there's no relationship with obesity that they can detect.
I wish I knew.
This is your study. This is not my study.
Oh, I don't know which study you're talking about, but
what's the study you're talking about, Tucker?
I guess we don't know.
Give me a sec.
I mean, the study, the nutritionists in the study that you're claiming, they say that yes. What they say is this: they say that if you don't adjust for energy, what do they say? They say that right. If you don't adjust for energy, then olive oil consumption in Greece, I think it's in Greece, then olive oil consumption in Greece is associated with high BMI, right? Olive oil consumption in Greece is associated with obesity. That's what they say. And then they say, but
no, that's not what they say.
No, that is what they say. They say, but if you adjust for energy consumption, then
they say adherence to a Mediterranean diet was essentially unrelated to BMI, with small differences depending on model choice and having no practical consequences.
Right. But then when you look, they say, well, you have to adjust for energy for that to be true. And so what they're saying is that the people eating the olive oil are consuming more calories and they're becoming obese. But the question is, why are the people eating olive oil consuming more calories than the other people? Right. You have to read between their
the difference between when they were controlling and not controlling for energy intake wasn't material. It was a 2-point increase.
A 2-point increase in BMI. That's a lot. That's like 10 pounds.
it's not that much in the context of what is causing this overwhelming
sure, but if you can,
obesity in these countries.
But if you can show
right?
that difference in actual real life people, that's a pretty big difference. Based on dietary
But
trends.
it's lost.
Find other
Again,
studies.
we're getting back to food frequency questionnaires, right? They're not super accurate. There's a huge margin of error. Hanging your hat on a tiny difference in a study that depends on food frequency.
I'm not hanging my hat on that. It's one data point of many, but it is a data point that does show that in Greece, olive oil consumption is associated with obesity.
Of no practical consequence.
Well, that's what the nutritionists say. The lead author on that is literally, she is known as the mother of the Mediterranean diet, and she is literally the disciple of Ansel Keys. So of course she's not going to say olive oil makes you fat.
But their data doesn't show that it makes you fat. They looked across quintiles and they didn't see a significant effect. So if it's such an obesogenic element, why don't they see a big effect?
I mean, they show two points of BMI. That's like 10 pounds. I think that if you can look at people at random, give them a dietary survey, and it predicts a 10-pound differential, that's a pretty big deal.
Couple pounds in the context of an epidemiological study is noise.
Okay, well, we differ then on the look. That's what the evidence is. There's another study too, but whatever. I just picked that one because I liked. I put that one in the video because I thought the language of the authors is funny.
What's the other study say, Brad?
The other study is called it's called the Sun Cohort. I wish I could remember more of the title. Basically, what they showed is that they took young people, so people in their 20s, and they divided them into like groups that ate the least olive oil, and then the middle, and then the most, and then the groups that ate the most and then increased it. And basically what they showed is that the people who were eating the most olive oil, and especially the ones who increased olive oil consumption, were more likely to become obese over the 3 years of the study. And so, that could just be calories. They could just be gluttons, but the ones who ate the most olive oil and continued to eat olive oil became obese, were more likely to become obese. And then the last one, the last one.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say the last one I sent to Tucker was the Predimed study, which has all kinds of problems. The Predimed study is a bit of a disaster.
We agree on that.
But one of the things that they do show is that substituting 5% of calories of PUFA, which is interesting, with monounsaturated fat, tended to lead to increased risk of developing obesity again. Similar to the Sun cohort study in the finding, and they don't specify the type of PUFA. They don't specify if it's seafood or sunflower oil. My assumption is that it's mostly sunflower oil because sunflower oil is widely eaten in Spain, where that study was done. But again, there's not lots of great human data, is the reality.
What about the isolated indigenous populations that are still not eating a Western diet that people talk about in the anti-seed oil conversations? Dr. Chris Kenobi is big on talking about those different population studies, evaluating people. Is there anything that we can pull from in their consumption of oleic acid or non-consumption?
Well, they generally, for starters, they don't eat a lot of linoleic acid, right? I don't think any of them that I'm aware of eat a lot of olive oil, and they're probably getting, they're getting the bulk of their fats from either coconuts, or in the case of, coconuts or animal fats, or in the case of the Bushmen, they're getting it from mongongo nuts, which are high in oleic, but also high in linoleic. And I want to share one more image here. This is from a study called.
Before we go to that, Brad, do you know anything about indigenous cultures that?
Like I say, I don't know of any indigenous cultures that are using a lot of high oleic acid foods. I do. Here's one thing I'll say about this, actually. So Native Americans, a main source of calories for them was acorns, and acorns are like they're sort of like canola oil. They're like 60% monounsaturated. They're maybe 10 to 20% polyunsaturated, depending on the acorn. And Native Americans were known to boil the acorns all day and then remove the fat off of the acorn meal before just eating the pure starch. And so the Native Americans would remove the oil that was, like I say, it's a vast majority of MUFA with some PUFA mixed in there, and they knew not to eat that.
Well, you're assuming that's why they were doing it. I mean, one of the other reasons they might have been boiling them all day was that they're very high in tannic acid and that they're pretty nasty to eat, and that the American Indians only ate them as a starvation food.
But no, they ate them as a staple for sure. But on the West Coast, the quote is that the acorns that were not high in oil, they would leach the tannins out with cold water. But the oilier acorns, they would leach the tannins out with boiling water to remove the fat from them. Is the actual quote from the person who observed this process.
And I've also seen a quote saying, "Stop complaining about the acorns. It's better than starving," from another source that I could look up in my database if you give me a couple of minutes. I do want to highlight one thing here that makes this conversation we're having very problematic. This is from a paper titled United States Dietary Trends Since 1800, Lack of Association Between Saturated Fatty Acid Consumption and Non-Communicable Diseases. Pretty cool paper. So, and this time, hopefully, here we go. Okay, can you see that, guys?
No. No, I can.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm trying to up my game, and I'm using Microsoft Paint because I can make the pictures bigger. So I guess Brad and I are approaching sheets of paper asymptotically here. And what does it show? It shows that the polyunsaturated, the yellow line, has steadily gone up across since 1909 when we started collecting data, and so is the monounsaturated.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason is that a lot of the fats that we're eating, the animal fats, are high in, the vegetable oils are often high in these two and low in the saturated fat, which is why the saturated blue line has been much more stable than the other two lines. Right. So it's kind of a huge confounder when you're looking at any sort of population, because even if you see a population, that's going through what they call the nutritional transition, where their monounsaturated fat content is going up, their polyunsaturated fat content is also going to be going up. So it's just,
and obviously I would assume that a lot of that increase in monounsaturated fat is due to the rise in poultry. I don't know if you would disagree with that, but
yeah, that would make sense.
Especially with that inflection right around 1960, which is kind of when they modernized the broiler industry.
Yeah, that would make, I mean, and to that point, chicken's the biggest source of polyunsaturated fats in the American diet, surprisingly, to me anyway, because of how they feed them. They're feeding them, seed oils and grains like corn to fatten them up.
Yeah. In fact, there's a law. It's not really a law. It's standard practice that it is considered animal abuse if you do not supplement your chicken feed with vegetable oil. This is set by a national, I forget the acronym of the national board. They kind of set animal feeding standards. No, it's not AFCO. I wish I knew the name off the top of my head, but they set the national feeding standards, and any local feed mill will follow those feeding standards to the limit. So if you go to a feed mill and say, "Hey, can I get a barley-based chicken feed that doesn't have any additional vegetable oil added to it," they'll say, "Well, that's animal abuse," and they won't do it.
I've
Can you
looked. I've
actually
looked
wait a
up-
second? Does that mean you would actually you can actually get cited for animal cruelty if people find out that you're feeding?
I don't think I don't think you can get cited for animal cruelty. It's just that the feed mills will not violate this set national standard, because they don't want to get sued or whatever, right? It's just
or they don't want to have the regulators pile in on them.
right. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so they're just following the rules, right? And or they're following the standards, they would probably say. Let me see.
Why is that? Why does that monounsaturated consumption rate drop down around 2000 in that chart, Tucker?
I don't know.
So here is I have one more little thing I would like to present if we have time, or if Tucker, if you don't.
Yeah, no, I was looking for the feed. I have a neat paper in here looking at dog food just to make Brad's point of why that would be the case. They don't consider any other fat. That organization that Brad's talking about, and I can't remember what the name is right at the moment, but they don't consider any fat basically to be essential except for linoleic acid, despite the fact that science has moved on from that. Even for dogs, they're recommending a high carbohydrate, high linoleic acid. I think the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in the typical dog food diet that they recommend, their model diet is like 30-1. So it's nuts. So I don't have any trouble at all in believing what Brad is saying there. Having looked at the dog food stuff, it's just crazy.
Yeah. No, animal feeding standards are kind of insane. And they're very old school. I mean,
they're great if you're looking to create fat animals. They're perfect for that.
True. Anyway,
Brad, is it your opinion that like conventional beef has too much monounsaturated fat for your health likings for this issue?
No, so here's the thing, right? I think that the unsaturated fat increasing, or the monounsaturated fat specifically increasing some of these enzymes like D6D is a real problem. I think that if you're obese, it's probably more likely to be a bigger problem for you. I think that beef is appropriate. So beef is similar. This is an interesting thing. So they looked at. I pulled up this study actually from 1943 with human body fat composition. So this is before seed oils or any of the oils are really a thing. This is human body fat composition from 1943. So that's 5 individuals. And I wrote down on the bottom there the composition, and this is in Ohio. So these are Midwesterners. It's 37% saturated, roughly. You have to kind of add in a few numbers that are not shown on this list. It's around 52-53% monounsaturated, and it's around 10 or 11% polyunsaturated, right? So that's the norm. And so my opinion is that what happens is when the body sees pure oleic acid coming in, it thinks, well, we've got to make some saturated fat to blend this with before we can safely store it and use it. And that is why the something like olive oil increases lipogenic enzymes in the liver, right? Because you want to really kind of crank that up. And I think that's also why
olive oil, Brad, olive oil, the problem with this model, though, is olive oil through conversion to OEA actually downregulates SCD in the liver. It doesn't upregulate it.
Sometimes it does. I mean, the study with the first study that I showed would beg to differ with that. They showed that 5%. They showed that 5% oleic acid in the diet tripled SCD1 expression. That's what they showed, right? And so, and again, that's a mouse model.
5% oleic acid in the diet is pretty low.
I know. Well, it's pure oleic acid. It's not balanced with saturated fat, and so it's pure oleic acid tripled SCD1 expression, and it doubled or tripled D6 delta 6 desaturase expression.
And
right?
is that in the context of a high linoleic acid that's going to block the effect of OEA? I mean, it makes
it was pure olive oil. right? Pure olive oil, pure olive
you're
oil.
talking about the Japanese study with the triolean?
No, it's another mouse study. It was 2017. It was this one. I showed it. It's 2017 and plus one, right? And so you can see the. Well, I don't know. Can you see the diets there?
Barely.
Yeah. So what it is yeah. So they have this one diet that is this pure olive oil, and the other diet is like, it's like a weird. This is a French study, so this is probably the French hitting back on the Mediterranean diet to some extent. But but what they show is that 5% of olive oil in the diet, as opposed to this other diet, which is roughly equally linoleic acid and oleic acid, led to this huge increase in, and here it is, right? So SCD1, let me see here, am I on the right side? Yeah. So there's the two desaturases, SCD1, and this is D6D. This is the thing that leads ultimately to arachidonic acid. And so, and this is the liver fat accumulation from 5% linoleic acid, as opposed to 2.5% linoleic acid and this is 5% olive oil, right? So that's almost all oleic acid. This one is the same amount of fat, but it's 50-50 linoleic and oleic acid. And it's the oleic acid that is increasing fatty acid synthase, that's increasing SCD1, that's increasing FADS1, the thing that converts the linoleic acid to arachidonic acid, and then the oxidized lipins. Because I believe that oleic acid triggers the liver to kick in all of these. Well, I mean, oleic acid clearly does trigger the liver to kick in this lipogenic enzyme expression and to start converting linoleic acid to arachidonic acid and then the oxidized lipins. And like I say, that was replicated in that other study that we spent a lot of time on with the plenish. But I do want to show this. And so this is the ramifications of this in humans, right? And so this is the EPIC study in Potsdam. And so this is showing diabetes risk. And you can see that, I don't know, we probably can't see it that well, but so this
Brad,
is—
can you send all those papers, and we'll link to them and reference in the show notes, because this is going to get lost for people that were.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I just want to say, so what they're looking at here is delta-6 desaturase activity. And so what that means is you can tell how active an enzyme is by looking at the thing that it, so like in this case, so there's an enzyme D6D we mentioned, and what it does is it takes linoleic acid and it converts it to something called GLA. And so if you look in a tissue at the amount of GLA versus the amount of linoleic acid, you can tell how active the enzyme is, right? Because it's converting A to B. And so you compare the amount of A and the amount of B, and that tells you how active the enzyme is. And so what this shows is the percentage chance of someone developing diabetes over the next 5 years based on how active their delta-6 desaturase gene is. And so in the lowest group with the least active delta-6 desaturase, 47 people developed diabetes. In the group with the most active delta-6 desaturase, 264 people developed diabetes. So we're talking just a massively, if you have upregulated delta-6 desaturase, you have a massively increased chance of developing diabetes because you're converting all of that linoleic acid to arachidonic acid, and that's going to become all the oxidized lipins. And so this is an RCT in humans, and what they did was they replaced the sunflower oil in these people's diets with olive oil. And what happened is that delta-6 desaturase activity, based on the exact same metric in this study, went up by 50%. The end product of delta-6 desaturase, GLA, went from 0.26 to 0.37, right? So I've showed multiple studies in mice where a little bit of olive oil or a little bit of oleic acid increases delta-6 desaturase, right? This is an example of an RCT in humans that olive oil clearly increased delta-6 desaturase, and we have good evidence that if you have high delta-6 desaturase activity, that is a massive risk for diabetes.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I don't think what's driving it is oleic acid. You're looking at a victim.
Well,
and
why? But
blame-
why when you
So
swap
here,
out?
Brad, slow down a little bit.
All right.
Let me get this up on the screen. So let's say we want to stop this process, right? We want to stop the upregulation of fatty acids in the gut or in the liver, right? Chronic, here's OEA, oleoyl ethanolamide treatment. OEA treatment decreases hepatic triglycerol level in rat liver by a PPARY gamma SREP-B mediated suppression of fatty acid and triacylglycerol synthesis. So this is the chemical that's produced from oleic acid that is blocked from production in the context of a high-fat diet, right? The reason you're seeing these effects from oleic acid in these models you're looking at is because the natural effect of oleic acid in the diet is not happening, right? The off signal is not being produced. OEA is the off signal for satiety. It's also the off signal for excessive fat production in the body. But oleic acid is not causing that. We know
Tucker,
that oleic acid is not causing that because when we look at different models exploring which fats are causing the obesogenic effect, you have to have linoleic acid, and you have to have linoleic acid producing its metabolites, right? Even if you hold oleic acid constant across different studies.
But
you're doing again what I've described. You're picking parts out of a process, and you're ignoring other parts that don't correspond to the story that you want to tell, right?
But I just showed the 2017 +1 study where 5% of calories as oleic acid. That was as olive oil. So there's no linoleic acid there.
And what's the rest? Brad, what's the rest of the diet? Right? Just the fact that you eat something and it upregulates an enzyme in your body doesn't translate to an end result. We've looked at that repeatedly in the studies that you've been showing here.
But you just said that the thing that blocks OEA production and that whole cycle is linoleic acid. Well, those mice were not getting linoleic acid. They were just getting 5% of their calories.
I haven't even been able to look at the study. I can't even see the sheets of paper that you're holding on the screen. But the studies that I have looked at of yours, that's what they all show, that they're doing it on top of an obesogenic diet, which is a high linoleic acid diet.
Is that true, Brad?
No, that's not true. I sent him another study. I sent him another study.
The case.
Wait a second. Let him finish.
Yeah.
I sent him another study, and unfortunately, I don't have the name off the top of my head.
Okay, correctly. You didn't send me any studies. All the studies that I've looked at are the studies that are on your YouTube video
in the video, right? So I talk about a study in the middle of that, and it shows very clearly the upregulation of delta 6 desaturase and delta 5 desaturase by a diet that is specifically high in oleic acid. It's high in monounsaturated fat. It's low in polyunsaturated fat compared to a diet that's high in saturated fat. So there's one diet that's high in saturated fat, low PUFA. There's one diet that's high MUFA, low PUFA. And in that study, the high MUFA diet clearly increases delta 6 desaturase, just like this 2017 +1 study, just like that human RCT that I just showed with olive oil. And the same thing, incidentally, is true of Predimed. And so you just see very clearly across the board that oleic acid increases delta 6 desaturase activity.
Predimed found that oleic acid was beneficial.
Right, but it also showed...
Predimed was this big quote-unquote RCT that was done in Spain.
Do you want that image still up, Tucker?
No, I can stop that image. Hold on. I want to show you another one, though. So here's another...
So what's the rub here? Why are you guys looking at similar studies and concluding vastly different insights? Tucker, you're saying that it's not accounting for a high linoleic acid diet that they're eating in addition to the oleic acid. And Brad, you're saying that's not the case? Is that
I'm saying that's not the case. Yeah.
Okay, here's what I was trying to show. So this is an RCT in humans looking at replacing different dietary fats. They start with the control, which is safflower oil, as I recall, high in omega-6, low in oleic acid. The green boxes are weight loss, right? The gray bars are oleic acid. So what we see here is that as oleic acid goes up from the right to the left, that weight loss increases in humans. This is a human RCT, right? What appears to be driving this, which is what's consistent with the experimental evidence, is the yellow bar. The yellow bar is linoleic acid, and as that goes down, weight loss decreases. So I just don't see it, Brad. It just doesn't. I mean, you're picking bits out of different papers to create a story talking about enzymes being upregulated. But when somebody does the actual RCT in humans, they don't see the result that you're predicting.
So RCTs in humans are complicated, as we know, but the RCTs, look, that enzyme shows, we know that. I feel like you're disagreeing with the idea that increasing the oxidation of polyunsaturated fats is probably not what we want to do. Like, I think we don't want to oxidize.
You haven't showed us. You showed us the Diol paper. And you're claiming a conclusion that they didn't make in their own paper.
Well, I've also showed a 2017. There's another paper in the video that I've shown. I showed this 2017. I showed this 2017 plus one paper.
The enzymes that you're citing don't increase oxidation of these fats. They convert the fats from one form to another, and they put them in different locations in the body. They're not involved in fatty acid oxidation.
Right, but nonetheless, as you increase oleic acid, you see increased oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. Furthermore, in humans, as linoleic acid decreases in phospholipids, you see increased risk of things like diabetes and obesity.
Yes, except when you actually inject these fats into humans.
Okay, but when you
do that, you see a reduction in liver damage and a reduction in diabetes. Okay, increasing oleic acid is protective.
Here's the thing: decreasing, when you see in humans that are all eating a sort of average normal-ish diet, when you see linoleic acid drop, that means that the enzyme D6D is upregulated, and we see that, and that is a massive,
right.
And that is a massive, hugely increased risk of diabetes when that happens, and also obesity when that happens, right? So what you see in increasing levels of obesity, what you see in diabetes, is that linoleic acid levels are actually dropping, and it's because delta-6 desaturase is converting those things to arachidonic acid, which ultimately become the oxidized lipins, and of course that involves that involves the cytochrome P450 enzymes, and it involves all these other things that we're not even gonna. That's way too weedsy to get into today. But the first step, because
you're claiming this is a fundamental process, and I agree, it's really interesting. But to claim that that's being driven entirely by oleic acid is a big claim, and we need to see some evidence that actually supports it.
Okay, but that's fine.
The evidence that you've shown us for humans doesn't support that process is actually happening.
Hey, Brad.
So here's the thing. The point of this discussion today, right, is that everyone simply dismisses oleic acid as a problem without really giving it its due diligence, right? I'm talking about a lot of different studies, and most people are just like, oleic acid, it's fine, don't worry about it. But I'm saying no, I think there's enough smoke here, and there's enough fire that we can't just sweep it under the rug. I think that oleic acid.
Wait, let him finish.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that oleic acid's clear effects on lipogenic enzyme expression, liver fat accumulation, and activation of delta-6 desaturase, at least, need serious consideration. There's a lot of papers out there. There's a lot of literature. There's a lot of data in humans, mice, pigs, rats, and I think it needs to be seriously considered. That is my position.
Okay. I brought this image back up because based on what you just said, it's rather important to note that not only were these people obese, but they were also diabetic with fatty liver disease. This was a fatty liver disease treatment protocol. Okay. Everything improved as oleic acid went up. Their fatty liver improved, their insulin resistance improved, their fasting insulin levels went down, their HbA1c levels went down, all in humans with increasing oleic acid intake. It doesn't happen in people the way you're describing it.
So
Brad, what's your response to this data here that he's presenting?
First off, I don't like. I haven't seen this particular paper. I don't know that doesn't sound like a great study population to be looking in. These, I think what happens in the context of healthier people is
who else are you going to do this study in? If you're looking to figure out if given fats are beneficial or harmful in a diabetic population, you feed them to people with diabetes.
Right, but how did they get diabetic in the first place is what I'm actually more interested in.
The control diet was the standard diet that they had been eating. That was the point of the control diet.
Well, I mean, look, okay, so flip side, look at Predimed, right? So everyone in the Predimed study was chosen because they were either diabetic or they have major symptoms of heart disease. 90% of them, their primary cooking fat was olive oil. 70% of them consumed more than 4 tablespoons of olive oil a day. So everyone in the Predimed study became diabetic by eating olive oil.
What percentage? You're presenting one data point out of context and concluding that that's what drove what happened to them, right? The study concluded that eating olive oil is good for you.
I know what the study concluded. Obviously I tend to disagree with the authors. I don't disagree with the authors. I don't disagree with their primary point. I just further asked the question of, why are all these people that were very high on the Mediterranean diet scale all diabetic to begin with? Spain, they eat a lot of olive oil in Spain, and it's one of the most diabetic countries on the planet. It's the diabetes ALS, the last data point was like 10.3% of Spanish adults are diabetic, right? So they're almost as diabetic as the US. Italy has nearly the same amount of liver disease as the US, fatty liver disease. And so you look at the Mediterranean where they eat a lot of olive oil, and comparatively to other countries, they're not doing well epidemiologically. And so then, sure, you can look at a study in diabetics with fatty liver and change some, in that context, a lot of things are happening there. I'm unconvinced.
Here's what the Predimed authors found. I think I tweeted this the other day. Looking at replacement, and by the way, this is not a great study, but what they found was that in most contexts, MUFA was beneficial, not harmful. There was one context where it showed a small signal for harm. In most contexts, they found that it was beneficial. This was, unfortunately, a statistical reanalysis, not the actual study results, but it's the one that Brad's been citing, so that's why I'm using it. And unfortunately, my little program here is hung again. So I will stop sharing for a minute, and so we're not looking at a blank sheet of paper. Right, 4 different criteria that they looked at. 3 of the 4 showed benefit of MUFA. Their final conclusion was that MUFA is beneficial across the board.
Right. Yeah. And so
it's not saying what you say it's saying, Brad.
Well, the authors, right. And so a fun thing, right. So I've just started looking, I'm talking about Predimed because it happens to be in my mind because I've been looking through the papers recently because, I don't know, somebody mentioned it and I thought I'd look it up. So what you see in Predimed is that there's actually, everyone was already eating the Mediterranean diet initially. And so they told people to eat the Mediterranean diet, and their diet didn't change that much. It's maybe like the percentage of calories from fat, and it was mostly from olive oil in the control and the intervention arm, went from like 30, I can't remember off the top of my head, 33 or 34 up to like 38%, right? So there's a very small differences between the control and the intervention, but the intervention group was given this very high polyphenol, virgin olive oil, and so it looks like most of the benefits are probably from the polyphenols.
Except the study that you claim that you cited in your video that you said showed that doesn't actually show that.
Sure, it does.
No,
tell us what we're
doesn't.
looking at, Tucker. Is this from that study?
Yeah, so this is from Predimed. They're looking at reversion of obesity. To the right is better with the increased nutrient, right? So we see 3 out of 4 of these, the situation, increased MUFA, decreased saturated fat, increased MUFA, decreased protein, and increased MUFA, decreased carbohydrate are all beneficial for obesity. The only one that shows a negative signal here is increased MUFA and decreased PUFA. Right.
So, right. But that's not, but right. So that's one. So they have different ways of looking at it. One is the other thing that I studied was, or the thing that I sent you was.
Now let's look at Brad's polyphenol study.
Let's let Brad finish that thought.
Okay, go ahead.
I think that's the same. I think you're in the same paper, but there's another table. I think you have to scroll up. And what it shows is that people who increased their monounsaturated fat had a much higher likelihood of becoming obese over the terms of the study. And so you have this duality where on average, some people, right, you have this weird duality. When people increase MUFA, some of them lose weight, some of them become obese. And there's a statistically significant number of people became obese when they substituted MUFA when they substituted out PUFA and added MUFA. And at the same time,
here's the conclusion of the paper, and I quote, "In conclusion, this study provides evidence that increasing MUFA and PUFA intakes at the expense of saturated fat, proteins, and carbohydrate intakes may contribute to losing weight and reverse the state of obesity in an older and overweight obese Spanish population." So no, they do not find that MUFA is causing obesity in Spain outside of one small context.
Sure, but it again, I mean, yes, and it's a weird study. I think we both agree it's a weird study, and they fail to sort of explain why all of the people who were eating olive oil wound up in this study to begin with. I mean, for me, that's the biggest red flag of the study is people who wound up diabetic and in this study were already eating a lot of olive oil. But anyway,
are you done with that image?
No, I've got another one. Here we go. So this one's too small. Let's zoom this in a little bit.
Drag it out, yeah.
So this is Brad's polyphenol study that he goes over in his YouTube video. Frankly, this is one of the worst studies I've ever seen, and it's not too surprising as it was funded by Unilever, the makers of vegetable oils and, of course, olive oils. So what they did was a design where they took everybody at the baseline, they then gave them refined olive oil, and they then gave them extra virgin olive oil. Now, Brad claims in his video that refined olive oil didn't cause them to lose weight, that only the extra virgin olive oil did, and that therefore it was the polyphenols which were present in the extra virgin olive oil and not in the refined olive oil, right? But the way they did this study is first they gave everybody in the study refined olive oil for 4 weeks, and then after that, they gave everybody extra virgin olive oil. Now, the problem with that is if you're doing a study like this, you want to do what's called a crossover design, where half the people get one treatment first and the other half get the other treatment first. And that way, if there are any effects of the individual treatments across time or sequentially, that they will even out across the two groups. They don't do that in this study, right? What they do is they show us how much weight people lost. And you can see that the people getting the refined olive oil in the beginning lost just about as much weight as the people getting the same people who then got the extra virgin olive oil. So the polyphenols, there was a tiny little bit of acceleration in weight loss, but they were losing weight regardless of the polyphenols. We can see that clearly from the data that's presented here because they didn't present it cleanly in the paper.
And so the difference there is about maybe 1 pound between baseline
1%.
and it looks like body weight kilograms on the right. It goes from 80, it's a little hard to say, 80 and a quarter.
This is your study, Brad. That's why I'm looking at it.
Okay. Well,
okay.
You misquoted.
Let Brad finish a little bit of a response.
We've got wait. We've got 2 key points here. One, they're feeding them oleic acid in 2 different forms, and they're both losing weight. Okay. And also, the polyphenols don't seem to make that much of a difference, if any at all. It's such a tiny increase that it may just be the fact that they were on the diet for a longer time. It's hard to tell because they didn't do a proper study design. Thank you, Unilever.
I agree.
But you shouldn't be citing this.
I agree.
Is bogus.
I agree this is a bad study, and I did not say anything about weight gain or loss. What I said was that
that's not
what
correct.
What I said was that if you look at the phospholipids, which they reported, there were no evidence of increased D6D activity or of lipogenic or of an increase in lipogenic enzymes. That's what I said due to the extra virgin olive oil. That was my quote, right? My point was talking about delta 6 desaturase activity and what we could glean from feeding studies in humans where they fed people olive oil and how did it affect the underlying enzyme systems, right? There obviously there's not a lot of variation on your vertical axis there. So the total range is maybe 3 or 4 pounds in that study. And, so what you see is, but here's the thing about olive oil. So, and about oleic acid is, so olive oil activates, it activates your fat burning system. This is true. And in the short term, that's super beneficial. But in the long term, that can lead to problems because, what happens is, olive oil, if you feed someone olive oil and carbohydrate in the same meal, what happens is they can't oxidize those carbohydrates. And so the olive oil sort of makes you acutely insulin resistant. And so what you're doing is you're burning carbohydrates and you wind up converting those carbohydrates to fat. And in a lot of people, in a lot of contexts, this seems to work for a while. But my question is, when does if you're doing all this lipogenesis, if you have these increased lipogenic enzymes, when does your kind of luck run out? Some people clearly can do it forever, and other people's not so much.
Okay, let's go back to that paper. It took me a while to get this out.
Oh, maybe I might also be confused. I might also be confused about which paper you're talking. I thought you were talking about
this is the one with the olive oil and the polyphenols. Consumption of extra virgin olive oil, rich in phenolic compounds, improves metabolic control. The
Got
graph
you. Okay, I thought we were talking about a different study. Yeah.
EVOO consumption significantly reduced fasting plasma glucose and HbA1c and body, as well as BMI and body weight. Refined olive oil did not. That's not what the study showed. The study showed that they both had the same effect, as I just demonstrated.
You keep citing the conclusions of the authors. I just wrote what the authors
This is your
said.
conclusion.
I know, but what I'm saying is in study after study after study, you're just simply repeating the conclusion of the author. And what I did here was I repeated the conclusion of the author. So,
and then you commented that refined olive oil did not. That's what I'm addressing. And the study did not show that.
That's the conclusion of the authors, though.
That's the data in the study. That's not their conclusion. That's what the data showed.
Okay, so now the shoe's on the other foot. I for one time cited the conclusion of the author rather than digging deeper into the data.
No, you actually.
And I'll admit,
yeah. Okay. So
but the whole time this whole
note
discussion.
To self, don't quote studies funded by Unilever.
Well, sure, but all I'm saying is in this whole discussion, I've been citing the data, and you've been citing the conclusions of the authors. And
no, you're not. Sure,
for a second,
you're not, Brad. That's my problem. Is that you're not citing the data. You're making conclusions by picking bits out of studies and making claims tying different processes together without looking at the context
Well, I guess we can't
of
see
the
my screen right
metabolic
now.
processes.
I guess we can't see my screen right
Can
now.
you
But
move your image off, Tucker, so we can see
Yeah,
what
here,
he's
let me
saying?
stop sharing that.
Who wrote those red letters, by the way? Refined olive oil.
That was Brad.
Okay.
that was me scrolling that on there. I did not spend a lot of time looking at that study. In fairness, that was kind of a throwaway, admittedly. So you got me on a throwaway line there. But this is actual data, right? This is the data of the authors. Those two mice getting equally fat, or soybean oil versus plenish. The plenish is 2.6% linoleic acid and it's 26% oleic acid, and those mice are basically co-equally as fat, I would argue, as the soybean oil diet. And you can see that there's not a lot of asterisks, so statistically they get equally fat whether or not the diet is high oleic acid and only 2% linoleic acid, as if they're eating just regular old soybean oil. And so I'm not simply just picking apart little bits of data. This is what we see in mouse studies, and I think this is an important point.
Except you're quoting a paper from authors who published, if I remember correctly, 3 different papers showing that higher levels of oleic acid causes less obesity, and you're claiming that it's obesogenic.
Didn't you just say look at the data, not the conclusions of the authors?
I saw the data. I saw that the line for the lower obesogenic, the lower oleic acid fat causes less obesity.
They're statistically indistinguishable at the end. I mean, this is you're now splitting hairs, right? The plenish diet made them very, very fat.
I want everybody to take a pause, and I want each of you to now steel man the other person's position. Make the best case for the other person's position as you have give them the best benefit of the doubt of the analysis of the data that they're looking at here. And Tucker, I'll start with you. Give me steel man his position as strongly as you can, just so we understand the best part of what he's saying and where he could be right.
Well, I think let me just Brad's making a really interesting point that oleic acid may make linoleic acid toxicity worse. Okay, is that fair, Brad?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, that's a really interesting argument. And some of the papers that he shows do seem to show that that is an effect. And that is worthy of further analysis. I don't think it's conclusive. I don't think it's been shown yet in people, but it's definitely signal that's present in some of the animal models that he's showing. That, I think, is something that we should definitely be looking at. This overwhelming claim. Okay, so I'll stop there. I steelmanned his argument. I think that's the strongest part of what Brad's showing us here.
What's the best point? What's the best presentation that Tucker's making in response to your argument that you hear?
Right. And so Tucker is making the argument that obviously the primary thing that is driving, obesity and these other health crises that we're seeing is oxidized linoleic acid, and that is the key thing to focus on. And I obviously we agree on the oxidized linoleic acid, and he's arguing that the data is inconclusive. He's saying the data is inconclusive in humans, and I agree with him. The data is inconclusive in humans. And so, again, I think we largely agree that further study is needed to know if some of these issues are real.
Tucker, what do you need to see specifically in the data to be more convinced that oleic acid may be more dangerous, all things being equal? What do you need to see in particular?
Well, what I'm aware of, there are 3 different human studies looking at increasing oleic acid as a treatment for diabetes, and they all 3 show benefit. You'd need to show a better quality study than those 3 showing that the reverse happens. That oleic acid actually makes increasing oleic acid in the context of decreasing linoleic acid actually makes it worse, because that's not what we see in the human data now.
Brad, what do you need to see to get off of oleic acid's tail?
Yeah, well, I mean,
Nice way to put it.
I mean, similar, right? And like I say, like obviously, I'm bringing this up because nobody else is, and I think there's a lot of smoke here, right? And that's why I've been on it. Sure. I mean, yeah, it's hard. It's always hard, right? Because you can't do the types of it's difficult to do the types of RCTs in humans that you really want to do, and I think we all have been frustrated by this at times. And I also believe that a confounder, there's always a lot of confounders in human studies. The humans are obviously very hard to study, right? I think there is a confounder with the different types of enzyme systems that are affected by oleic acid consumption. I think there's essentially is sort of kicking you into a different mode of metabolism, and you see that by decreased glucose immediately postprandially. You oxidize less glucose when you eat oleic acid. That's been shown 15 times in humans, and so you're kind of like shifting from I guess what I would call an insulin-based metabolism to more of a fat-based metabolism when you eat oleic acid. And so that can have benefits for some people. So it's very complicated. And the problem is I don't even know, like, I'm not sure what the best RCT design would be. But that's a very interesting question. And I guess I will say I'll give it some thought because I don't have an immediate answer.
Okay, that's fair. Tucker, is it fair that if he is making a good point that monounsaturated fat in the presence of linoleic acid could be a problem, would that mean that perhaps people who are obese would do wise to avoid high monounsaturated fat foods?
See, the problem with that is that the clear effect of increased linoleic acid is glucose metabolism dysregulation. I firmly believe, based on the evidence I've seen, that linoleic acid is what's driving diabetes. If you say that you can't consume oleic acid, then the best treatment at the moment that we have for diabetes from a dietary perspective is to go on a high-fat, low-carb diet. Right? That's been shown to be effective. Verda's done a fantastic job of doing that. And Dr. David Unwin in England has done a fantastic job of doing that. By definition, given the foods that we have available, that's going to be a high oleic diet. Right? So
because you're going to eat so much meat. Is that why?
As we discussed at the beginning of this, tallow's 40% oleic acid, lard's 50% oleic acid, assuming you get a good lard. Brad will tell you all about that. Butter, I think, is like 35% oleic acid.
What about milk? Milk? What's in milk?
Milk.
I think dairy fat's a little lower. I think dairy fat is only about 20 to 25%.
Okay, that Brad's probably right about that. So, I think personally, a high dairy fat diet is probably the way to go, assuming you can eat dairy fat. But I think demonizing a fat that we are well adapted to eat and have been eating for millions and millions of years, I think, frankly, Brad's making the same mistake that the saturated fat people have made, right? This is a fundamental human nutrient and has been for as long as we've been human. We didn't have diabetes for the whole time, right? I mean, you can... so in the context of a high linoleic acid diet, I haven't seen any evidence that this would be beneficial. And I think that if you followed this approach, you would be turning away from an approach that we do know is beneficial in real people with diabetes.
And that is the low carb, high fat diet.
That's right.
Brad, do you think the low carb, high fat diet, as he described, is too high in oleic acid?
No, so that's actually a really important point, and I'm glad we're bringing it up because I do think that there is a context matters, right? And what I see is that high oleic acid in a context of a sort of mixed diet where you're eating a lot of starch, that is where I'm the most concerned because of its immediate effects on it stops you from oxidizing glucose, right? So to me, that's a big concern. On the other hand, in a ketogenic context, I think it's much less problematic, right? You're not even if you upregulate some of those enzymes, you're not feeding carbohydrates, so you don't necessarily have the fuel to do de novo lipogenesis, even if that were to be the case, that some of those enzymes were upregulated. And so I don't. To me, MUFA in the context of a mixed diet is more concerning than MUFA in a context of ketogenesis, or a low carb diet, we'll call it.
Brad, do you have a range of how many grams of oleic acid do you think are like healthy to stay around? Do you have any of that thought?
Well, so I want to be clear that I'm not my goal.
I know you don't like making prescriptions for people.
I don't like making prescriptions for people, and my goal is not really to demonize oleic acid. My goal is really to say that I think the ratio of saturated fat to oleic acid is important, right? That is really, like, if people walked away with one take-home message, that's what I would want it to be, is that you properly balance that. And so I wouldn't say there's necessarily like an upper limit of oleic acid you should eat, because that is going to depend on if you're a keto dieter, it's probably more than if you're eating a mixed diet, etc. And I'll just say one more thing. This is a fun anecdote.
Saturated fats in the body are converted into oleic acid.
Well, some of them are. Mostly stearic acid is, but the other ones can be, of course. But what I was going to say is that a fun anecdote that I had at the beginning of one of my other videos is that when I went to the French Culinary Institute, the first step in most of the recipes was we would take these lardons, which are these little strips of pork belly, and we would weigh out an equal amount of pork belly and butter, and we would saute those lardons in the butter, and then that was the fat that became the basis of the sauce. And so,
God bless the French.
Right. And so when you look at the French, right, they have very good, they've had very good health for the most part over the years. And one of the things that they're doing is when they use animal fat, they consistently add butter to it because, presumably there's some weird ancient chef knowledge there that pork fat is fine as long as you add butter to it, right? And so that to me is one of the theoretical basis for why this ratio of saturated fat, because butter is like 80% saturated. It's very highly saturated, or it's 75% or something. And so so if you add butter to bacon fat, you're going to end up with a very high saturated to monounsaturated fat ratio at the end, and that's what the French do. So to me, that's another.
So Brad, you're saying it's not about the gram amount of oleic acid; it's the ratio of how much oleic acid in relation to the saturated fat that you're eating.
Yeah, and again,
is that in one meal, or is that, you mean like throughout the day? Like, could you eat a high oleic acid meal and then a high saturated fat, and it will balance out, or is this the problem that you're seeing acutely in the consumption part? Like when you're
I don't know if I feel qualified to answer that question directly. The answer is I don't really know. And but I would. Yeah, I'm trying to think. For a second, I had a thought about another point I wanted to make, but it's gone, I guess. So, but I strongly think. Oh, I guess what I was going to say is this: when you think about human body fat, right? Our body fat naturally was around 40% saturated, and so if you eat pure oleic acid, you obviously can't, store that without doing some de novo lipogenesis. And so, but if you and that is, I think, is the difference between, those rats fed beef tallow versus olive oil, right? Is the if you give the rats the beef tallow, and this is, then they're fine.
Brad,
they're just going to eat the beef tallow.
Even the chart that you showed that most of the fat in a person is oleic acid. You absolutely can store oleic acid without doing,
but not purely, right? Like we have but there's a ratio, right? If you just ate pure oleic acid all the time, you would obviously dilute out the saturated fat in your body if you weren't doing lipogenesis, right?
That's why is that a problem?
It's just a problem because I believe that if you turn on your lipogenic, what we see is in fatty things, right? Fatty breeds of pigs have elevated lipogenic enzyme expression. Obese humans have elevated lipogenic expression, enzyme expression.
So what? What are you converting the oleic acid into that's a problem?
Well, you're not, but the oleic acid itself is blocking FAAH, and you have elevated anandamide, and it's
okay. So it's a problem in the context of a high linoleic acid diet, not a problem on its own.
Well, but you'll apparently only need 2.6% linoleic acid sometimes,
which is evidently high.
Which is evidently high.
Which is a whole other topic.
But you can't. But how do you get below 2.6%? I mean, that is a very miserly diet. I mean, that's hard to hit.
Oh,
even butter's that high.
Yeah, butter's that high, but you're not eating 100% butter. Or at least I hope you're not.
Yeah, is that 2.6 of your fat or diet consumption, or 2.6 of your total?
That was
2.6 of the butter.
No, that was I mean that mouse experiment that we were showing. Oh, we're right. 2.6 of the calories of butter. Is linoleic acid. Right, it's something around there.
Right. Depends so that's going to be
depends on the butter.
Assuming you're eating 10% butter, that's going to be 0.26% of your diet is linoleic acid, which is not bad.
Right, but then sure. But then if the rest of your diet has, chicken or pork or these other sources, it's coming in from everywhere.
So it seems like it could be that Ray P is the solution for both of you, because he's going to say lots of milk and fruit, right? And sugar, right? And so that way we're going to avoid this whole debate about how much chicken fat, how much pork fat, right? How much.
Well, Ray P's starting from the same place we're both starting, which is that you've got to avoid linoleic acid. And additionally, I mean, if you want to, this is probably another thing that's going to cause a lot of people to blow up. But if you want to increase the saturated percent of your diet, the best way to do it is to eat a lot of safe starches like rice, right? Because excess glucose is turned into palmitic acid, which is a highly saturated fat.
But if lipogenic enzymes are increased, you'll be more likely to make them into oleic acid.
Which isn't a problem. I mean, look, SCD1 inhibition is really bad for you. Your body needs oleic acid. Your body is making phospholipids and membranes out of it. And if you if you knock out or inhibit SCD1, you start getting really bad effects in the body. Oleic acid is not harmful. It is. It's beyond. This is like the old argument about glucose. People would say, well, glucose is important to your body. Yes, it's so important that your body makes it, so it never has a shortage. The same thing is true with oleic acid. It's so important to your body that your body makes what it needs.
So if you look at cultures around the world, most those Americans in 1943 that I showed, but also Koreans in 1960, they actually, traditionally people had much lower oleic acid content in their body fat than they do now. And so one of the things that preceded the obesity epidemic was a rise in oleic acid in people's stored body fat. And so that's another thing that gives me pause when I say oleic acid is fine, eat as much as you want.
Yeah, but that's classic correlation, not meaning causation.
Agreed.
We know the mechanistic pathway from dietary fats to obesity. And I don't want to repeat myself, but it doesn't run through oleic acid. But because of the fats we're eating, oleic acid and linoleic and polyunsaturated fats, and I didn't run a regression analysis on that chart that I showed a while ago, but it looks pretty damn close to a perfect correlation between the two.
But you just showed this chart that also shows a correlation between rising oleic acid. I mean, right? The chart that you showed rising linoleic acid.
They're going up at the same time.
Acid. They're going up in parallel, right? And I personally, I think that one enhances the other. I think that the oleic acid enhances the toxicity, as you said, of the linoleic acid. And I think that is the thing that ultimately needs, right? That's what we need to. Is what needs to be figured out, right?
So
what's the extent that matters in humans? How? Yeah.
So it sounds like we both agree that higher oleic acid is going to be much less problematic in a low linoleic acid context.
Agreed.
Is that
Okay.
when you're saying that, are you saying consumption of linoleic acid, or are you saying body fat storage of PUFA when you're talking about?
I meant consumption of those two
Yes.
fats is
I-
much
I-
less problematic in a low linoleic acid context.
So what if you've still got
I don't
PUFA?
agree with Brad's argument, but I think it's fair to say that that's something that we both agree with, that linoleic acid is driving the harmful processes.
So what about if you have a high PUFA storage on your body? Would you also say be careful about your MUFA consumption? Or
Well, that's the interesting point that Brad is raising here.
Yeah.
I would think not, because we have the human trials that show an improvement of body composition and liver fat and diabetes on higher oleic acid intake. So yeah, no, I wouldn't think, but it's an interesting point, and some of the animal models do show it. So
Brad, is it your point that if we had never had this, linoleic acid poisoning with seed oils over the decades, that, monounsaturated fat would not be a big concern for you, oleic acid?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. And when you look at the enzyme systems, what you get into, I see this positive feedback loop happening where something happens initially, and that triggers the upregulation of this lipogenic genes and SCD1 and delta 6 desaturase, but what that leads to is this sort of perennial. You just keep cranking everything you eat. You just keep turning it back into oleic acid, and then oleic acid in our bodies rise. And I think that's a real problem. And I think it leads to all kinds of problems. And so, in my opinion, having too high of oleic acid in your body, in your muscles, in your fat cells is a problem for sure. So that is where I differ from Tucker. But yes, in essence, though, I think the question at the beginning is, does dietary oleic acid increase, oxidation of these polyunsaturated fats, and to what extent does that affect actual humans?
You're saying that remains unconclusive. That remains inconclusively determined. You're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's better evidence for it than Tucker believes that there is. But the nature of human data is that it's always messy, and there's always, it's humans are tough to study, right?
So you're saying
you're urging the studies we'd like to do.
You're urging caution on high oleic acid food consumption.
Right. And one of the reasons that I say, and look, I don't really like controversy. I really don't. One of the reasons I raise this point is just that I feel like no one else is. And I see enough questions about it that I think that conversation needs to be had. So
you think oleic acid is
having the conversation.
You think oleic acid is that friend that's always hanging out, laughing at seed oils, and you're like, I don't trust this guy. I don't trust this guy for one moment. I don't know where he's from. I don't know what his deal is, but you guys got to watch him. He's going to knife us when we're not looking. That's what you're saying.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
That's a lot of rap songs about that in the 2000s, about watching out for that guy that you don't know where he showed up from. Tucker, I appreciate you coming on, and Brad Marshall, great discussion. I think you guys did a good job. No shots fired. If there's further research or papers you guys find that you want to do another discussion, I think people would be excited to see that, because there's more research needed on this topic, but you've both raised good points.
Yeah, agreed.
Thanks for having us on, David. Thank you, Brad, for standing up for your beliefs and doing this. I don't want to call it a debate. It's more of a conversation, I think, and I hope people learned a lot from our discussion.
Yes, thank you, Tucker. I think that was a very fruitful discussion, and that was great. I'd be glad to come on and do it again. And of course, David, thank you for hosting. And we'll see you both next time, I guess.
All right, very good. Take care.
Amen.
All right, thank you.
Bye.